Deputy Sheriff Christopher Look only registers half the license plate before the black 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont skids off, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Inside is a man and a woman, and they're now barreling down a narrow dirt road in the dark of night. After less than a minute, they come upon a bridge, but the car is going way too fast. The driver brakes, but it's too late, and the car plunges into the water and lands upside down on the bottom. An hour later, the driver, Senator Ted Kennedy, is back at his hotel, sound asleep. And the woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, is still in the car at the bottom of Pocha Pond. She is dead. On July 18, 1969, a group of political aides called the Boiler Room Girls were attending a reunion party on Chappaquiddick Island, Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. It had only been a year since the assassination of Bobby Kennedy during his presidential run, and after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, the future of the Kennedys' political ambitions had fallen on the youngest brother, Edward, or Ted Kennedy. The Boiler Room Girls had been political advisors to Bobby Kennedy during his presidential campaign, but had now transferred their allegiances to Ted. On the day in question, Kennedy, along with his cousin Joseph Gargan, and his friends Paul Markham and John Crimmins, who was also Kennedy's driver, had traveled down to Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard to take part in the Edgartown Yacht Club Regatta taking place on the 18th and 19th of July. Later in the evening, they were hosting a cookout on Chappaquiddick Island, a 500-foot ferry ride across from Edgartown. After taking the black Oldsmobile Delmont on the ferry across to Chappaquiddick, Crimmins drove Kennedy down Dike Road and across Dike Bridge to Tom's Neck Point, where the senator had a quick swim. Then they drove to Lawrence Cottage, a secluded house that Gargan had rented to host a cookout and reunion party. There, Ted changed his clothes, and while Crimmins made him a rum and Coca-Cola. Then, the two traveled back across to Edgartown to compete in the regatta. Afterwards, Kennedy made a quick stop at his hotel, the Shiretown Inn in Edgartown, to change into evening wear before going to Lawrence Cottage to attend the cookout. At 8:30 in the evening of July 18th, the 6 Boiler Room Girls arrived at Lawrence Cottage after leaving their hotel, the Katama Shores Inn in Edgartown. There, they joined Kennedy, Gargan, Markham, and Crimmins, as well as Charles Treader and Raymond LaRosa for a night of partying. They had hors d'oeuvres at 9 p.m., and Kennedy had another rum and coke and 1/3 of a beer. Then they all sat down for a late dinner. At 11:15 p.m., one of the Boiler Room Girls, Mary Jo Kopechne, complained to Kennedy that she was not feeling well and asked if he could drive her back to her hotel in Edgartown. Kennedy, also wanting to leave but seeing Crimmins and the others still having dinner, decided to drive her himself. The two got into Kennedy's black Oldsmobile and set off towards the ferry landing. Along the way, Kennedy got confused, and instead of following the Chappaquiddick Road that veered to the left, he took a hard right onto Dike Road. All of a sudden, Dike Bridge appeared in front of them. Kennedy slammed on the brakes and left a 33-foot skid mark on the ground. But it was too late, and the car plunged into the water off the right side of the bridge and landed upside down at the bottom of Pocha Pond. Kennedy managed to get out, but when he came to the surface, Mary Jo was nowhere to be found. Kennedy tried to dive down and rescue her, but the current was too strong, and soon he gave up, laying exhausted on the grass beside Pocha Pond. After recovering, he walked back to Lawrence Cottage and summoned Gargan and Markham. The 3 men then got into Markham's rented white Valiant and drove down to the ferry landing. But it was past midnight and the last ferry ride off the island had left. All of a sudden, Kennedy jumped into the water and swam the 500 feet across to Edgartown. He then walked back to his hotel, got into bed, and went to sleep. This is what happened that night according to Kennedy's first statement. At 8:20 the next morning, a teacher and a student who were going fishing at Tom's Neck Point spotted a submerged car resting on its roof in Poacher Pond. They quickly ran to the nearest cottage and notified police. Edgartown Police Chief Dominic James Arena was first on the scene. He tried to dive down and get Mary Jo out of the car, but because of the strong current, he wasn't able to. Instead, divers were called, and John Farrar, captain of the Edgartown Fire Rescue Unit, arrived at 8:45 a.m. He was equipped with scuba gear and entered the water. He discovered Mary Jo's body in front of the back seat. Captain Farrar removed her from the vehicle, while Police Chief Arena went back to Edgartown after finding out that the car was registered to Senator Ted Kennedy. Shortly before 10 a.m., Kennedy and Markham walked into Edgartown Town Hall, where Police Chief Arena was stationed. Kennedy was told that his car had been found and immediately said that he had been the driver and requested a room where he could write a statement describing what happened. After writing it, he gave the statement to Police Chief Arena and instructed him not to share it until his lawyers had time to look it over. Then he left along with Markham and immediately departed to his family home in Hyannisport. The media soon swarmed the little town on Martha's Vineyard demanding answers. Kennedy wasn't speaking to the press, but Police Chief Arena decided to release the statement to quell the crowd of reporters gathered outside Edgartown Town Hall. But instead of an explanation, it raised more questions about Kennedy's actions that night. On July 22nd, Kennedy attended Mary Jo's funeral. He had not been seen in public for 4 days, and he was asked when he would make a statement and answered that he would do so at the appropriate time. During the funeral, Kennedy was wearing a neck brace, something he had not been wearing before and would not wear again. On July 25th, Kennedy's lawyers had negotiated a deal with District Attorney Edmund Dennis, and he would plead guilty to leaving the scene of an accident, the least serious charge under the circumstances. The guilty plea meant Kennedy didn't have to testify to what happened on the night of July 18th. His statement was taken as fact. He was given a 2-month suspended sentence and 1 year's probation since he had no prior criminal record. This meant that he was free to go. But Kennedy did have a criminal record. During his college years, he was cited for reckless driving, racing to avoid pursuit, and driving without a license after racing away trying to escape police during a traffic stop. The same day he pled guilty, Kennedy, in an attempt to save his public image and political career, gave a speech on national TV.
Instead of looking directly for a telephone after lying exhausted in the grass for an undetermined time, I walked back to the cottage where the party was being held and requested the help of 2 friends, my cousin Joseph Gargan and Paul Markham, and directed them to return immediately to the scene with me. This was sometime after midnight, in order to undertake a new effort to dive down and locate Miss Chappaquiddick.
The speech added a whole new part to Kennedy's story, a part not mentioned in his original statement. He had now, along with Gargan and Markham, undertaken a second rescue attempt after walking back to Lauren's cottage. But the speech did not answer the most critical question. Why didn't he report the accident? The seemingly conflicting statements about what he did that night and the pressure from the media and the public prompted District Attorney Dennis to hold an inquiry to decide if Kennedy should be prosecuted further. Six months after the accident, and after multiple attempts by Kennedy's attorneys to delay and stop it, an inquest was held, and for the first time, Kennedy was questioned about what happened the night of July 18th. His official story was now that after leaving Lauren's cottage at 11:15 p.m., a time he had gotten after looking at Crimmins' watch, since Kennedy himself wasn't wearing one. He got in the car with Mary Jo Kopechne. After driving, he made a wrong turn onto Dike Road. He couldn't explain why he didn't follow the paved Chappaquiddick Road that veered to the left, or why he didn't recognize the change in terrain from the paved road to the dirt road. Because it was dark and there were no street lights, he didn't see Dike Bridge until it was too late and he crashed off the side of it. He claimed to be unfamiliar with the road, despite having driven down that road the same day. He testified that he was going 20 miles an hour, but calculations using a fall formula and based on the length of the skid marks, the speed had been closer to 35 miles an hour. After getting out of the car, something he had no memory of doing, he made several unsuccessful attempts to dive down to the car and then walk back to Lauren's cottage to get help. On his way, he passed 7 houses, which he claimed not to have seen, even though the lights were on in a few of them. He also passed the island fire station, but once again, he hadn't seen it. Then he arrived back to Lauren's cottage, where he summoned Gargan and Markham and told them what happened and demanded that they go back and try to rescue Mary Jo. 20 minutes past midnight, they got into Markham's rented white Valiant and drove down to the scene of the accident. Kennedy got the time from looking at the clock mounted on the dashboard of the white Valiant. But this car did not have a clock installed on the dashboard. After repeatedly diving into the water for what Kennedy estimated was around 45 minutes, the 3 men gave up and drove down to the ferry landing. But the last ferry had left at midnight, and the time was now 1:30 a.m. After asking Markham and Gargan not to say anything to the other boiler room girls about the accident, since Kennedy thought that they might risk death trying to save their friend if they found out, he dove into the water and swam the 500 feet across to Edgartown. He then walked back to his hotel, changed his clothes, and after trying to get some sleep, he walked down to the hotel manager and complained about a loud party at 2:25 a.m. At 8:40 the next morning, Kennedy seemed cheerful and in good spirits talking to a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Richards, outside his hotel room when Gargan and Markham approached him. They were noticeably stressed and agitated. After pulling Kennedy into the room, the 3 men emerged 3 minutes later. Kennedy now mirrored the feelings of the other 2, and they left without saying goodbye. The 3 men then took a ferry ride over to Chappaquiddick Island shortly after 9 a.m., but they stayed at the ferry landing, where Kennedy used a payphone to make several phone calls to his family lawyer, Bert Marshall, and his political strategist, Dunn Gifford. At 9:30 a.m., the 3 men took the ferry back to Edgartown without ever leaving the ferry landing. The ferry operator asked if they had heard about the accident on the island, and the 3 men said they had just heard about it. During the inquest, serious doubts about Kennedy's timeline was raised after Sheriff Deputy Christopher Look, who was stationed on Chappaquiddick Island, testified. His shift ended at 1:30 midnight, and he was driving down Chappaquiddick Road when he saw a black Oldsmobile parked on the side of the road. He read part of the license plate as L7, with the last number also being a 7. Look, thinking somebody might need assistance, stopped his police car and got out. As he was approaching, he observed a man in the driver's seat and a woman in the passenger seat. But as he got closer, the car suddenly sped off and drove down Dike Road. The time was approximately 1:45 a.m. But by this time, Kennedy's car with the license plate L78207 was already at the bottom of Pocha Pond, according to his testimony. Since Kennedy was first to testify during the inquest, he never had to answer to or explain any of the inconsistencies in his story. Why he walked past all those houses and the fire station without seeing them? How did he see the time on a clock that didn't exist? Why did his time of leaving the cottage at 11:15 p.m. not match Deputy Sheriff Look's observation? How did they have time to make the second rescue attempt if Sheriff Deputy Look was correct, since he was back in Edgartown by 2:25 a.m.? If Kennedy had planned to go back to Edgartown, why didn't he tell anyone at the party before leaving? And if Mary Jo had planned to go back to her hotel, why did she leave her purse and her hotel room key behind? Another troublesome detail was the positioning of Mary Jo's body. She had been found with her head pressed up against the floor in front of the back seat by Captain Farrar. He testified that this is where an air pocket was likely to have formed, and based on the position of her body, he theorized that she had not drowned, but instead suffocated when there was no air left in the pocket. He explained that if this was the case, she would have been alive for hours before suffocating, and if he had gotten the call right away, he would have been able to save her. But because no autopsy was performed on Mary Jo, we will never know exactly what killed her. Kennedy had a lot more than a third of a beer and 2 rum and cokes. He was likely intoxicated, and so was Mary Jo. They planned on having sex when they left, and she left her purse and hotel room key behind, and he didn't tell anyone that they were leaving because they were coming back to the cottage afterwards. They got in the car and left at around midnight and drove down the road and parked. All of a sudden, a police car pulled up behind them. Kennedy, being both married and a U.S. senator, didn't want to get caught drunk driving or cheating on his wife, so he decided to speed off, as he had done in college. He drove down Dike Road at 35 miles an hour and came up too fast on Dike Bridge. He tried to brake, but it was too late, and the car plunged into the water. He got out of the car and probably did dive down a couple of times trying to rescue Mary Jo. After failing, he decided to walk back to Lauren's cottage. Because he was drunk, he passed the houses and the fire station without sounding the alarm, because he knew he would be going to prison. He quietly summoned Gargan and Markham and probably told them what happened, but Kennedy assumed that the car wouldn't be found at the bottom of Pocha Pond. Because it was dark and he was drunk, he didn't realize how easily it could be spotted in the daytime. The 3 men then drove down to the ferry landing, because the other boiler room girls would be questioning where Mary Jo was if he returned alone. Since no ferry was coming, Kennedy decided to swim across. Then he walked back to his hotel. After changing his clothes, he walked down to the hotel manager at 2:25 a.m. and claimed he had been awakened by a noisy party in order to establish an alibi for the night in case the car was found sometime in the future. The next morning, he was talking to Mr. and Mrs. Richards. He was described as cheerful, probably thinking he had gotten away with it, when Markham and Gargan showed up to inform him that the car had already been found. Because of his political career, he made up the story about the second rescue attempt in order to make it look like he had made every attempt to save this poor girl, which he hadn't, since he didn't call the police. A popular theory of what happened, proposed by a detective for the district attorney's office, Bernie Flynn, has Kennedy drunk driving and intending to have sex with Mary Jo, but after they drove away from Deputy Sheriff Look, Kennedy, according to this theory, got out of the car because he didn't want to get caught, and Mary Jo then drove off alone. Kennedy then went back to his hotel, and Mary Jo drove the car off the bridge by herself. The circumstances that support this theory is the fact that Kennedy seemed unbothered the next day until he talked to Markham and Gargan. The fact that Mary Jo didn't seem to have any visible injuries, which is more consistent with sitting in the driver's seat, and the fact that Kennedy didn't remember how he got out of the car. However, him being unbothered could be relief that he got away with it, or simply being the type of person to not care at all about this woman. An autopsy was never performed, so it's impossible to know the extent of Mary Jo's injuries. Also, him not remembering could be a sign of trauma, or he could be lying since he is ashamed of the way he left Mary Jo behind. This theory also doesn't explain why Kennedy didn't just walk back to the cottage and resume the party after he got out of the car, but instead chose to walk all the way back to the ferry landing and swam across to Edgartown. Also, Kennedy's statement to the police on the day after mentions the car being upside down in Pocha Pond, something he could not know unless he had been at the scene. For the people who still believe this theory, you have to tell me one thing. Kennedy called his lawyer before making his statement. If you were his lawyer, would you tell him to lie and say that he was there and he was driving and open himself up to possible prosecution? Or say he wasn't there because he wasn't? Now, if you picked A, you really shouldn't be a lawyer.
Over 10 years ago, I testified in court in detail, under oath to God, to the truth about the accident at Chappaquiddick that caused the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. That sworn testimony has been published and reprinted many times since then. I know that there are many who do not believe it, but my testimony is the only truth I can tell, because that is the way it happened.
Press X to doubt. Thanks so much for watching. I really enjoy making these. If you would, leave a like and a comment and subscribe and do all that stuff. And if you want to support me even more, I have a Patreon link in the description. Anyway, that's all for this one. I'll catch you on the next one. You guys have a nice day.